Los Angeles, spring of 1950. The jacaranda trees are in full bloom along the winding roads of Hollywood Hills, their purple petals scattered across manicured lawns like confetti after a party no one remembers attending. Inside a whitewashed house with a kidney-shaped pool and a view of the canyon, an 11-year-old boy sits on a suitcase, not beside it, on it, as if his body weight alone could hold down everything that is about to fly apart. His name is Joseph Ira Dassin, and he doesn't fully understand what is happening. He understands fragments. The lowered voices, his mother's red eyes, the way his father keeps pressing the phone receiver to his ear like it might tell him something different the second or third time. He understands that something enormous and invisible has entered the house, something that doesn't knock. His father, Jules Dassin, the man who just 2 years ago was celebrated in the pages of Variety as one of the most gifted directors in American cinema, has received a summons, not a formal one, something worse, a whisper, a name on a list. And in 1950 in the United States of America, a name on a certain list is a death sentence for a career, a reputation, and sometimes a life as you knew it. Joseph won't understand the full weight of this moment until years later. But sitting on that suitcase, watching his mother press a handkerchief to her mouth, he feels it in his stomach. That specific wordless terror of a child who knows the adults around him have lost control. This is where Joseph Dassin's story truly begins. Not with the applause, not with the sold-out arenas or the 25 million records. It begins with a suitcase, a telephone call, and a childhood that dissolves in a single afternoon. To understand the boy on the suitcase, you have to go back 50 years and an ocean away to a small town called Buk in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was a world of cobblestone streets, Yiddish prayers, and the constant low-grade anxiety of being Jewish in Central Europe. That ancient exhaustion of being tolerated but never truly welcomed. From this world came Samuel Dassin, a young man with restless feet and a hunger that the old continent simply could not feed. In 1904, Samuel boarded a ship and sailed toward the idea of America. He arrived at Ellis Island carrying little more than a name and a willingness to reinvent himself. The immigration officer who processed his papers, whether through carelessness, indifference, or the simple impossibility of rendering Eastern European phonetics into English, wrote down Dassin instead of whatever Samuel had offered. And Samuel, perhaps not fully understanding, perhaps simply too grateful to be on the other side of the Atlantic to argue about spelling, accepted it. Just like that, a family name was transformed by a stranger's pen. It was, in miniature, the great American transaction. You give up something old, you receive something new, and you're never entirely sure what you've lost in the exchange. Samuel settled in New York, married, and began the slow, grinding work of building a life. His son Jules was born in 1911 in the neighborhood of Harlem, not yet the iconic cultural capital it would become, but already a place electric with the collision of immigrant ambitions and American realities. Jules grew up navigating that collision daily. He was sharp, sensitive, and possessed of a ferocious creative imagination that had no obvious outlet in the world he'd been handed. But Jules Dassin was not a man who accepted the world he'd been handed. He pushed. He fought. He taught himself theater, then radio, then film. By the 1940s, he was in Hollywood, directing pictures that crackled with social urgency and visual intelligence. The Naked City in 1948, shot on the actual streets of New York with an almost documentary rawness that felt revolutionary, announced him as something rare, a filmmaker with a conscience and a camera. Thieves' Highway followed, then Night in the City. Critics called him a master of noir. Studio executives called his agent. Life, for Jules Dassin, was finally gloriously working, And in 1938, in the middle of this ascent, his son Joseph was born. A boy delivered into a life of swimming pools and private schools and famous dinner guests and the particular golden warmth of a Hollywood childhood when Hollywood still believed in its own mythology. Joseph, Joe as everyone would eventually call him, grew up in a house where art was not a luxury but a language. His father screened films at home. Actors and writers and composers came for Sunday lunches that stretched until dark. The boy absorbed it all with the quiet intensity of someone who doesn't yet know he's being shaped. He was a happy child by most accounts. Curious, funny, gifted with languages in a way that suggested some deeper aptitude for understanding how people communicate, how they reach each other across difference. He had no idea it was about to end. The word McCarthyism entered the American vocabulary like a virus. Quietly at first, then everywhere, then impossible to escape. Senator Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee launched their investigations into alleged communist influence in American institutions, and Hollywood, with its history of labor organizing, its population of leftist intellectuals, its Jewish immigrant communities with their European socialist traditions, became a primary target. Jules Dassin had, at various points in his life, associated with left-leaning organizations. In the climate of post-war America, this was enough. He was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and given the choice that destroyed so many careers and friendships and marriages during those years, name names, give up your colleagues, betray the people who trusted you, or face the consequences. Jules Dassin refused. It was, depending on how you look at it, either the most principled decision of his life or the most devastating, perhaps both simultaneously. He refused to become an informer, refused to purchase his own safety with someone else's ruin, and the machinery of the blacklist ground his career to dust almost overnight. Films he was attached to were canceled, calls stopped being returned. The name Jules Dassin, recently celebrated, recently powerful, became radioactive in the industry he had spent his life building. The FBI came to the house, This detail surfaces in various accounts of the period with a specificity that suggests it lodged itself permanently in the memory of everyone present. Agents in suits, questions asked of children, the household turned briefly inside out by the clinical, impersonal efficiency of state surveillance. Joseph was old enough to understand that the men asking questions were not friendly visitors. He was young enough that the full meaning, the ideology, the politics, the history, remained beyond his grasp. What he grasped was simpler and more lasting. Authority could arrive at your door without warning and take everything. The family's options narrowed rapidly. Jules Dassin could not work in America. He could not simply wait it out. The blacklist had no obvious end date, and the family needed to eat, needed to live, needed Jules to be able to practice the only craft he knew. And so, in the early 1950s, the Dassins did what Jewish families have done across centuries of European history. When the walls close in, they moved. They left. Leaving America was not, for most people, a thing you simply did. America was supposed to be the destination, the arrival point, the place you came to when you had nowhere else to go. To leave it, especially to leave it as a refugee, as someone expelled by political persecution rather than choosing freely, was to experience a particular kind of disorientation that has no clean name. It was exile. Not the romantic literary exile of writers who moved to Paris to find themselves. It was the real kind, the kind with nowhere specific to go, with children in tow and a career in ashes. New York first briefly while arrangements were made, then London, gray and recovering from the war. Then Paris, which welcomed Jules more warmly than his homeland had, then Geneva, then Florence. Then Athens, where Jules would eventually find not just refuge, but a second artistic life. and a woman who would change everything. For Joseph, these years of movement meant something different than they meant for his parents. For an adult, exile is loss. For a child, it is simply reality, bewildering, occasionally brutal, sometimes secretly or secretly wonderful. Joe grew up speaking French, English, Italian, German, Greek, 5 languages before the age of 20, each one acquired in a different city in different schools where he was always the new kid, always the one who didn't quite belong, always the one who had to figure out the social codes from scratch. He fought in those schools, not frequently, but enough. The new kid with the American accent in the French school, the American kid with the French manners in the English school. He learned early and thoroughly that identity is not something given to you, but something you construct daily, under pressure from whatever materials are available. It was exhausting. It was also, in some ways, he couldn't have articulated at the time, an extraordinary education. In 1962, after years of a marriage stretched across continents and strained past its limits, Jules and his wife divorced. Joseph was 23. The formal dissolution of the family unit that had already been functionally dispersed for years. One more thing come apart. But somewhere in those drifting European years, a woman had appeared in his father's life who would matter to Joseph in ways he never fully expected. Her name was Melina Mercouri, Greek actress, force of nature, woman of volcanic warmth and absolute conviction. She and Jules fell in love in Athens, and she became, for Joseph, something his own mother never quite managed to be, a witness, someone who showed up. Someone who sat in the back of small, badly lit clubs when a young man who didn't yet know what he was tried to figure out if singing might be the answer, and who told him afterward, with the kind of directness that only someone completely secure in their own worth can manage, "You were beautiful." It is impossible to overestimate what those words meant to a young man who had spent his entire childhood being told in 1,000 indirect ways that he didn't quite fit. 1958, Joseph enrolled at the University of Michigan. He was 19 years old, in possession of a European sophistication and a transatlantic restlessness that made him feel profoundly alien among his American classmates. They seemed to him impossibly settled, rooted in their states and their certainties, confident in the shape their lives would take. Joe watched them with a mixture of envy and something like anthropological curiosity. He studied anthropology, which was perhaps the most honest possible choice for a young man who had spent his life observing human communities from the outside. He was a gifted student. He won the Hopwood Award for Literature, a prestigious prize, genuinely competitive, the kind of recognition that suggested a future in writing. He tried medicine. He abandoned medicine. By the time he was 25, he had 2 degrees, 6 languages, a literary prize, a half-dozen countries in his past, and no clear answer to the question that was becoming increasingly urgent. Who was he exactly? What was he for? The answer, when it came not from a degree program or a career counselor, from a stage in Paris. 1963. Joe Dassin, 24 years old, stood in front of a small audience in a Parisian cabaret and opened his mouth. And something happened. Not a miracle. Not immediately, but a direction, a sense, fragile and new, that this might be the place. That the voice, the languages, the years of absorbing different cultures and their music and their emotional frequencies might add up to something a specific audience needed. He signed with CBS Records. He found his collaborators, arranger Jacques Play, lyricist Claude Lemel. Together, they identified what Joe Dassin could offer that no one else quite could. An American's musical instinct filtered through French romantic sensibility, warmth without sentimentality, accessibility without condescension. The formula was deceptively simple. Executing it required exactly the person Joe had accidentally become. Someone from everywhere, rooted nowhere, fluent in the emotional language of multiple worlds. His first significant success, Les Dalton, arrived and announced him not yet a star, but a voice, a presence, the beginning of an answer to the question he'd been asking since the afternoon he sat on a suitcase in Hollywood Hills and watched his childhood end. The boy who belonged nowhere had found tentatively a place. He just didn't know how little time he had to stand in it. Paris, 1966. The city's doing what Paris does best, existing at a frequency slightly higher than everywhere else, vibrating with fashion and philosophy and the particular kind of beautiful self-regard that makes the rest of the world simultaneously resentful and hopelessly in love. Joe Dassin is 27 years old, and for the first time in his life, people recognize him on the street. It should feel like a rival. It feels mostly like pressure. He met Maris Massiera through the overlapping social circles that defined Parisian show business. The photographers, the stylists, the magazine editors, the models who moved through all of it like decorative planets in an orbit of glamour. She was beautiful in the specific architectural way of high fashion, with a quality of composed certainty that Joe, perpetually uncertain beneath his charm, found both reassuring and slightly intimidating. They dated. The relationship developed the momentum that relationships develop when both people are young and attractive and moving fast and not asking too many careful questions. Then Maris gave him an ultimatum: marry me or this ends. Joe Dassin married her. At the wedding, Jules did not smile, not from disapproval exactly. Jules Dassin was not a man who expressed himself through the conventional gestures of paternal sentiment, but from something more complicated, a recognition, perhaps, that his son was repeating a pattern, that the boy who had never learned to stay in one place was now being asked to stay in the most demanding place of all, a marriage. Melina, standing nearby, wore an expression that her face sometimes wore when she was watching something beautiful heading toward a cliff. Both of them understood something Joe didn't yet. He was a man built for longing, not a rival. His entire emotional vocabulary had been assembled from the experience of leaving countries, leaving schools, leaving versions of himself behind in cities that didn't want him. He was exquisitely equipped to want things, to have them, to hold them, to tend to them daily with the patient, unglamorous devotion that love actually requires. This was another skill entirely, and no one had ever taught it to him. The concerts multiplied. The road became his real address. He was charming on stage in a way he struggled to sustain in a living room. He was warm to audiences of thousands and elusive with the one person who needed him most. The marriage began accumulating its silences. Paris, May 1968, detonated Paris like a philosophical bomb. Students built barricades in the Latin Quarter. Workers went on strike. The French government trembled. The air smelled of tear gas and possibility. And every artist, every intellectual, every public figure was suddenly required, by the unwritten laws of that specific ferocious moment, to declare themselves. Joe Dassin declared nothing. He continued singing about love. The left despised him for it. How could you stand in the middle of a revolution and offer people pop songs about walking down the Champs-Élysées? It was, to the committed political mind, an act of almost offensive irrelevance. He was accused of being apolitical, which in that climate was tantamount to being accused of collaboration with whatever you opposed. Joe absorbed the criticism with a shrug that looked like indifference and was actually something more considered. He had grown up in a family destroyed by politics, by the machinery of ideological enforcement, by the way political systems use individual human beings as fuel. His father's career had been incinerated by a committee of men who believed their political convictions gave them the right to determine what an artist could and couldn't say. Joe Dassin had watched that happen from the age of 11. He had sat on a suitcase while it happened. He was not going to let politics tell him what to sing. And then a strange thing occurred when the barricades came down and the tear gas cleared and the exhausted, exhilarated, slightly lost young people of France emerged from their revolutionary moment into the ordinary morning that follows all extraordinary evenings. They discovered they were tired of manifestos, tired of the grinding intensity of political commitment. They wanted something human and uncomplicated. They wanted to feel something that wasn't rage or solidarity or ideological conviction. They wanted, in short, exactly what Joe Dassin was offering. His record sold faster after May 68 than before it. Make of that what you will. The song arrived the way the best songs arrive, almost casually, as if it had been waiting somewhere nearby and simply needed someone to notice it. Aux Champs-Élysées was not originally a Joe Dassin composition. It was an English song, Waterloo Road, adapted into French by Pierre Delanoë. But when Joe sang it, with that specific quality his voice had of making you feel he was singing directly and only to you, as if the microphone were a telephone and you were the one person on the other end, it became something else. It became a feeling, a collective memory of a Paris that may or may not have existed exactly as described, but that everyone who heard the song immediately recognized as real. It came out in 1969, and it became one of those songs that seemed to escape the category of song entirely and become instead a piece of shared emotional furniture. People heard it and felt instantly that they had always known it, that it had always been there waiting for them. Radio stations played it constantly. Couples danced to it at weddings. It echoed from cafe terraces and apartment windows on warm evenings. It became, in the truest sense, a classic, not because critics declared it one, but because ordinary people refused to let it go. But Joe Dassin almost didn't live to see its full impact. April of that same year, 1969, before the song had fully registered in the culture, Joe suffered his first heart attack. He was 30 years old. 30 years old, with a body that was already sending signals his lifestyle had been systematically ignoring, the drinking, the cigarettes, the schedule that treated rest as an afterthought, the emotional compression of a man who processed nothing and performed constantly. The doctors told him to slow down. He nodded. He understood. He went back on the road. What followed was perhaps the most productive and most self-destructive period of his life simultaneously. 1969 through 1972 produced an extraordinary run of recordings. Et si tu n'existais pas, if you didn't exist, in 1972 became something even larger than Champs-Élysées, a declaration of need so naked and direct that it made grown adults sit down wherever they happened to be and feel the full weight of everyone they had ever loved and feared losing. L'été indien, Indian Summer. Salut, 2 albums a year, hundreds of concerts, 25 million records sold. And underneath all of it, like a river running beneath a city, the drinking, the absences, the marriage accumulating its wounds. 1973, Marissa's pregnant with their first child. The pregnancy's difficult. The birth comes too early, weeks before it should, the small body arriving into the world before it was ready, weighing less than 2 kilograms, fighting for every breath with the ferocious, blind determination of new life that doesn't yet know it's supposed to be afraid. The baby, a boy, lived for 5 days. Joe was not there when it happened. He was on tour. Whether this was a logistical impossibility or an emotional avoidance or some unbearable combination of both is something only he could have answered, and he never fully did. What is documented is what happened afterward. He stood against a wall at the hospital silent. He did not hold his wife. He did not weep in front of anyone. He looked at a fixed point on the wall, and whatever was happening inside him, it stayed there, sealed, inaccessible. Then he left. He found a bar or a bottle or both. There are men who process grief outward, who cry loudly, who need company, who fill silence with words until the pain becomes speakable. Joe Dassin was the other kind. He processed inward, which is to say he didn't process at all. He compressed. He performed. He went on stage weeks later and sang about love with the same warmth and accessibility as audiences expected, and they had no idea, watching him, what he was carrying. That was both his gift and his damage, the ability to appear whole when something fundamental had broken. Maurice knew. She had been married to this man long enough to know the difference between private and hidden. She waited. She hoped. The waiting and hoping slowly became exhaustion, and the exhaustion slowly became something harder to name. 1977. The divorce was finalized after 11 years of marriage. Jonathan and Julian, their two surviving sons, were still small. Joe moved into an apartment that he furnished with the minimal temporary quality of a man who doesn't quite believe he'll be staying. He was 38 years old, alone in Paris and drinking more than he had ever drunk before. Christine Lefebvre was 24. She was a model, blonde, striking, possessed of the easy confidence of someone who had never had to question whether they belonged in a room. She appeared in Joe's life at the moment when he was most vulnerable and least equipped to make careful decisions. The relationship moved fast. The wedding in 1978 moved faster. Friends who had watched the first marriage fall apart said very little, which was its own kind of comment. Jules, hearing about the second marriage, said even less than he had said about the first. July 1980, Cannes. The summer heat pressing down on the Côte d'Azur with the lazy, indifferent weight of a season that doesn't care what happens beneath it. Joe Dassin had his second heart attack. The first one, 11 years earlier, had been a warning. This one was a verdict. The doctor who delivered it was direct in the way doctors sometimes are when they have run out of diplomatic options. If you continue living as you are living, the touring schedule, the alcohol, the refusal to rest, the systematic neglect of a body that has now failed twice, you will likely have 1 year, perhaps less. Joe Dassin looked at the doctor for a long moment. Then he said, "That means I have time to record one more album." It was either the bravest thing he ever said or the saddest, depending on how you hold it. Perhaps both. Perhaps they were the same thing for him. He had spent his entire life running from countries, from identities, from grief, from the question of who he was and where he belonged. To stop running now would require him to become someone he had never learned to be, a man who sits still with his own life and looks at it directly. He couldn't do it, or he chose not to. The distinction may not matter. The summer and autumn of 1980 became a marathon. Performances across Europe, the road stretching endlessly ahead. The body pushed past every reasonable limit. People who saw him during that period describe a man who seemed simultaneously more present and more gone than usual, as if some part of him had already arrived somewhere else and the rest was following. August 1980, Tahiti. He flew there to rest, genuinely this time, or so the plan suggested. The island with its extraordinary violent beauty, its blue water and impossible green, its complete remove from the European machinery of celebrity and expectation. Kristen was with him. His friend Carlos, the French-Spanish singer, one of the few people Joe allowed close enough to be called a real friend, was there too. The 20th of August was an ordinary day. Lunch at a restaurant near the water, the kind of meal that exists purely to extend a pleasant afternoon. Food arriving slowly, conversation drifting, the light changing on the water. Outside, halfway through the meal, Joe went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a man relaxed in good company. A different quiet, a sudden one. His hand found the edge of the table. His knuckles whitened. The color left his face in a way that made everyone at the table understand, instantly and without words, that This was not ordinary. He fell. A doctor who happened to be dining at a nearby table, a tourist there by pure chance, the kind of coincidence that seems either providential or cruel depending on its outcome, came immediately and began cardiac massage. The ambulance arrived. The machinery of emergency medicine engaged. At 14:20 on the 20th of August, 1980, Joseph Ira Dassin died. He was 41 years old. France learned about it through the radio, the way France used to learn things. The announcement cutting through regular programming with the specific gravity of news that requires interruption. People stopped what they were doing. People who had never met him and never would, who knew him only through a voice coming out of a speaker, felt something personal leave the world. On the streets of Paris, strangers told each other. Women wept in grocery stores. Men sat on benches and looked at the ground. It was the particular grief of losing someone who had given you language for your own feelings, who had sung the things you felt but couldn't say, and whose voice had therefore become, in some intimate way, part of your interior life. When that voice disappears, something in you goes quiet too. His body was flown to Los Angeles, to Hollywood Forever Cemetery, where the permanent residents include some of the great figures of American film history. At the burial, something unplanned happened, the way the most significant things always seem to be unplanned. Someone in the crowd began singing Aux Champs-Élysées. Then someone else joined, then another voice and another, until the cemetery was filled with the sound of people singing a pop song at a funeral. And somehow it was not absurd, but devastating, the most honest eulogy imaginable. Here's what you gave us. Here's what we carry. Here's what we will not let go. Jules stood at his son's grave and did not sing. He stood in his silence, which had always been enormous, and watched. And perhaps those who were there have speculated about this carefully, not wanting to put words in a dead man's mouth. Perhaps he understood something in that moment that he had never quite allowed himself to understand before. That the stage his son had chosen was not a lesser form of art, that the connection his son had made with millions of ordinary people was not a smaller achievement than a celebrated film, that the man he had sometimes seemed embarrassed by had built something that endured. It was, as Joe's own songs had always been, too late and perfectly timed simultaneously. Jules Dassin lived until 2008, 28 more years, long enough to watch his son become a legend. He spoke of Joe rarely and guardedly in interviews, which the people who loved Joe never entirely forgave. The silence between them, which had been one of the great unresolved tensions of Joe's life, simply extended past death and became permanent. Melina Mercouri became the Minister of Culture of Greece, a position she filled with the same ferocious conviction she had brought to everything, and died in 1994. She never stopped being, for anyone who knew her story, the woman who had sat in the back of bad clubs and told a lost young man he was beautiful. The world needs more people who do that. She understood it. Maurice retreated from public life with a completeness that suggested either profound grief or profound relief or both. She raised Jonathan and Julian far from the cameras, far from the industry, with a determination to give her sons the stability their father had never been able to provide. Both boys grew up. Both boys, by most accounts, became men their mother could be proud of. Kristen disappeared from public view almost immediately after the funeral. Whatever their marriage had been, rushed, perhaps mistaken, perhaps simply the last attempt of a lonely man to not be alone, it concluded with his death and left little trace. Here's the strangest part of Joe Dassin's story. He became more famous after he died than he ever was while living. In the Soviet Union, his music had already been filtering through on magnetic tape reels, passed hand to hand, copied on home equipment, shared in the particular underground way that beautiful things circulate when official channels won't carry him. People who spoke no French knew the melodies by heart, sang the phonetic shapes of words they didn't understand, because something in the music communicated directly, bypassing language entirely. After the Soviet Union dissolved and its borders opened and its people were suddenly free to consume the culture they had been denied, Joe Dassin was among the first things many of them reached for. He became, in Russia and the former Soviet republics, something approaching a sacred figure, not in a religious sense, but in the sense of something precious and slightly unreal, something that belonged to a private emotional world so many people shared without knowing they shared it. His records sold. His songs appeared in films and television dramas in the background of scenes set in the 1970s and 80s as a kind of shorthand for that specific, bittersweet, almost happiness of the late Soviet period. Today, young Russians find him on streaming platforms without context, without the cultural weight of the legend, and they respond to the same thing their grandparents responded to: the voice, the warmth, the sensation of being directly addressed. From Quebec to Senegal, the French-speaking world has its own relationship with him, different in its specifics, identical in its core. Everyone who loves Joe Dassin loves him for the same reason. He made them feel less alone in whatever they were feeling. He was not the greatest vocalist of his generation. He did not write his own lyrics. He was a performer of others' poetry, a vessel for words assembled by collaborators who understood what he could do with them. He did not live with the discipline or the self-preservation instinct of someone who believes his life and work must be protected. He made choices that his body paid for and that the people who loved him paid for too. None of this is the point. The point is the boy on the suitcase, 11 years old, sitting in the Los Angeles spring, watching his world dissolve, spending the next 30 years in motion, across continents, across identities, across languages and marriages and styles, and all the various experiments a man undertakes when he doesn't know who he's supposed to be, never quite landing, never quite belonging anywhere, carrying the specific, untranslatable loneliness of someone who has been everywhere and is therefore from nowhere. That loneliness went into the music. It had nowhere else to go, and Joe Dassin, whether by instinct or design, fed it directly into the songs, into the voice, into the particular quality of naked need that made "Et si tu n'existais pas" stop people in their tracks. His sadness was real. His longing was real. He wasn't performing emotion. He was reporting it, live, from the interior of a life that had always felt slightly unfinished. And the millions of people who heard him recognized it, not because they had fled McCarthyism or lived in 6 countries or lost a child or watched 2 marriages fail, but because the feeling underneath all of that, the feeling of being not quite home, not quite arrived, of reaching for something just slightly out of reach, is not specific to any biography. It is the basic condition of being human. Joe Dassin just said it better than most. He never found his home in life. He never settled into the identity that the 11-year-old on the suitcase was waiting to grow into. The motion never stopped. It just eventually stopped him. But his songs found a home in the hearts of millions of people across 6 decades and every conceivable border. They live there still, in the memory of a grandmother who heard them through a Soviet radio in a kitchen in Almaty, in the ears of a 20-year-old discovering them on a phone screen in Paris or Montreal or Dakar, in the specific tightening of the chest that certain melodies produce in certain people at certain moments when they are most honest with themselves about what they need. That home, the one inside other people, the one built for music and longing and the particular courage of a man who gave his real sadness to the world instead of keeping it, no one can take it away. No committee, no blacklist, no heart that stops too soon. The boy on the suitcase is still there somewhere, but he's not waiting anymore. He has already arrived.